Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I apologize that I'm speaking in English, but I still would like to thank the organizers, Mr. Casper, Dr. Casper, thank you very much, and also the Montafoner Museum, but also Robert Rollinger, who's a friend and has been kind enough to include me, but also I think who remains is Josef Wiesehofer, who said, I depend on you that you're going to do a good job. So he put me on the spot. So it's a pleasure to be here. What I would like to discuss today is a myth in Iranian tradition that I think has an impact on the ideology of succeeding, you might call it, Persian empires, specifically the late antique one, the Sasanian Empire. And this has to do with an archer who makes a brief appearance in the Avesta, the sacred Zoroastrian hymns, and his Avestan name is Erānšahr, and I have Persianized it as Arash. And so I would like to discuss this story or this myth in the context of Iranian history. In the Zoroastrian tradition, mountains play a prominent role, but a curious role. This is, by the way, where I was born, Tehran. So it has the Alborz mountains ranges are next to it. So you could tell the mountains, of course, mean a lot. But in the Avesta, specifically the 19th Yasht, which is called the Zamyad Yasht, the Yasht to the earth, there's a mention of a number of mountains right from the beginning of the hymn for the first 9 sections, where it is stated that 2,240 mountains grew from the earth, and it tries to name a number of them. Now, what is curious is that in the Zoroastrian tradition, the creation of the mountains from the earth is the work of the evil spirit, Ahriman, which assaults the earth and creates the mountains. And in response, Ahura Mazda has to actually sow glory, kind of melamu you might say, but it's khwarne, into the mountains to counteract this miscreation. And in Zoroastrian apocalypse, at the end of the world, the earth then will become flat. The earth, the mountains will roar, there will be molten metal, people get judged, and then the earth becomes flat and perfect, as it says, as it was in the beginning. So it is, again, in this context that I would like to talk about Arash's work. Now, as I mentioned, this archer is only alluded to briefly. That is, the economy of this Avestan hymn doesn't allow us to grasp what the entire story is about. But we do find in Yasht 8 of the Avesta, which is dedicated to the star Sirius, what is known as Tishtrya, it is described as if the stars formed, that is a bow and an arrow being shot from it. Now, this tradition is also associated with the month of Tyr, which is the rainy season. And it does have this underpinning of the fight between drought and the coming of the rain. And in this context, when the Avestan text is telling us about this battle, we find a brief, only twice, allusion. As such, which I will just read if you allow me. We worship the bright glory endowed star Tishtrya, who flies with such sparkle towards the sea Varukasha, a mythical lake, as did the celestial arrow, which the vibrant arrowed Erānšahr, its Avestan form, Arash, its Persianized form, the most vibrant arrowed archer among the Aryans or the Iranians, launched from a mountain called Mount Aryashita to another mountain, to Mount Damavand. So this is the issue at hand. It's the mountains. Now, Mount Aryashita has been suggested etymologically, most recently by Jean Kellens, to mean something in the form of the sneeze of the Aryas, or the Iranians, having been high, having been cold, and so sneeze is associated with. And I will explain the image here again, but these are Zoroastrian priest magi today, in recent times, at the foot of the Alborz mountain, the highest one being the Damavand, performing a yazesht, or doing a actually celebration. So what we know of this mythical mountain, or this mountain belonging to them, it's high, it's than the Iranian sneeze. Now, of course, when we put this, the Avesta and the story in the context of its geography, its original, perhaps, geographical location, although that is a point of contention, it is not the modern-day Iranian plateau, per se, that is the focus. But we think that, in fact, what the Avesta is describing is, of course, farther east. And modern-day central Afghanistan and to Tajikistan has been suggested, in fact, as this homeland, which in the Avesta, it is called the Aryan Vaja, the expanse of the Iranians, or the Aryans. So it's this central Afghanistan high mountains that is suggested to be the ranges that where the story is being told. With the coming of course, historical period, when I say historical, the coming of the Achaemenid Empire and the Arsacids that have already been discussed, and especially the Sasanians in late antiquity, we know that these sacred topographical names that are in the Avesta, which could be associated with what is Afghanistan today, is transposed. That is, as the Iranian tribes and these groups move to the Iranian plateau, these names now are associated with localities. For example, I just read Professor Rollinger's Raga, article Ray. Indeed, what the Avesta discusses as the city of Raga is not the city of Ray next to the city that I was born in Tehran, but obviously there have been other suggestions. I like Franz Grenet's idea that we're talking about Registan or Ragistan, somewhere in the Peshawar, closer to Pakistan. And so these names are one by one moved by the Iranians as they create their empire, and they place it they peg it onto the Iranian plateau. So here's what is modern-day Afghanistan and Tajikistan. So many of these Avestan terms begin to move westward. And when the Sasanian Empire, that is the last of these pre-Islamic Iranian empires, come to fore, and this yellow area would be really the utmost expansion, except a brief 7th century stint, they call their empire something similar to the Aryan Vaja. It's called Erānšahr, meaning the expanse of the Aryas, or the empire of the Aryas. And it's in this place now that these stories are going to be associated with specific cities and locations. Now, under Shapur I, in the 3rd century, the second Sasanian ruler who never missed an opportunity to put one of these rock reliefs in its homeland in Persia, because they were relatively successful against the Romans in the 3rd century, at least initially, I would like to suggest that Shapur as well plays on this myth of Arash, or Erānšahr, as an archer. But this, of course, is part of, I think, the political ideology of the Sasanian Empire, trying to show its power. But also, I would like to look at his inscription to make a suggestion that may be reflecting the story of Arash in the Avesta. Shapur has an inscription, which we call the inscription that has to do with Shapur's shooting. It's in a place called in Hajiabad. And of course, here's a Sasanian dish, and there's no shortage of Sasanian dishes showing the king shooting an arrow, usually on a horse, in a more Parthian style, you might say, if you want to have that. But the king is at hunt, and he's capable. In this inscription at Hajiabad, where there was forgeries also made, here's a hand copy of it. Shapur explains that I shot an arrow, and then I moved the crane even further back and I shot it. And if anybody is as strong-armed as I am, please come forth and let's see if you are. Now, this, of course, could be certainly part of this hyperbole of a Persian king saying that he's a great archer and challenging the others. And we do not need to look at, of course, Arash in the Avesta, but much more closer, one would just think of the Achaemenid Persian Empire with Darius, who in his Naqsh Rostam tomb inscription in DNB states, I'm skilled both in hands and in feet. As a horseman, I am a good horseman. As a bowman, I am a good bowman, both on foot and on horseback. As a spearman, I'm a good spearman, both on foot and horseback. These skills that Ahura Mazda set down upon me, and which I am strong enough to bear. By the will of Ahura Mazda, what was done by me, with these skills I did, which Ahura Mazda set down upon me. And of course, the king is Darius in his tomb, and usually they're shown holding a bow, which is part of the ideology of having power. But I'm wondering how much of this Arash story and this idea of a Persian, of course, being a good bowman, as Herodotus also, of course, doesn't miss to tell us that a young Persian must know how to ride well and be a good bowman, but also tell the truth, are part of this tradition, or are these coming together, coalescing? The story of Arash is again alluded to, but not clearly in the Middle Persian literature. We do have a mention of him in a text called Mah Farvardin Ruz Khordad, where it is said that on this day, and this month and day, Arash let his arrow. So that is clear that they are cognizant of the throwing of this arrow, and it is placed probably in a context of a war between the Iranians and the Turanians, their eastern nemesis. And here, the progenitor of these Iranians, in a way, is Manuchihr. And here's a sort of a late drawing of battle between the two sides. And here's a crown. And Frasiab, or Afrasiab, the enemy, who etymologically means one who holds water, or actually the bringer of drought. So you could see this Avestan tradition of Tishtrya, of drought versus rain bringing, is also playing still in late antiquity. Now, in this context, we get an allusion, but again, no long tradition until the Post-Sasanian period. Abu Rayhan Biruni, an important scholar who has left us much in terms of actually, I think, residue of beliefs, calendar, and ideas about many people of the world, but more specifically the Iranians, in the 11th century, actually begins to give us the first full treatment of what this story is about. That is from the Avesta, where it is only a brief allusion. We have no real long continuous tradition written down until Biruni. And Biruni is interesting in that it says it is manifest in the Avesta. So he is cognizant that there is a story at least being told, now by the priest or however he recorded this in Central Asia, that it is according to Avesta, this story goes on. And I've just put part of it to get a fuller idea of what this story is about. Then he, Manuchihr, the progenitor of the king of the Iranians, sent Arash to take a bow and to shoot an arrow. The context of this story is that Frasiab has attacked Iran and has defeated the Iranian forces and taken them all the way to this mountainous region close to the Caspian Sea. And the Iranian king is asking for to be given the chance to demarcate the new boundary between Iran and Turan by a shoot of an arrow. And Frasiab, of course, has no problem. How far can an arrow go? You see the sort of the context. And of course, Arash took off his clothes, and he says, when I shoot with this bow and arrow, I shall fall to pieces, and my life will be gone. But I have determined to sacrifice it for you. You could see this is a good story for nationalistic sort of imperial purposes of a boundary demarcation. And this is a person that, of course, is going to give his life for this, and he is without blemishes. All the signs of perfection are put into the story, and the shot is gone. And here again, we see some Zoroastrian and Avestan terminology being inserted to this text in Arabic by the order of the god, the wind. And this is, of course, the Zoroastrian deity Vayu, bore the arrow away from the Mount Ruyan, which is close to Alborz, which we saw its picture, and brought it to the utmost frontier of Khorasan. So this thing continues to fly with the aid of this wind, and Biruni tells us that it hits a nut tree, Jauz, and this story becomes what Biruni says, a celebration of Tirgan at the month, of water. And we know the underpinning story. And I think in Armenia also, this tradition continues as well, as part of this pagan, if you want to call it, or pre-Christian heritage of throwing water on each other on a specific feast day, as it still continues here and there. Where I live in Irvine, for example, by the lake, the Magi, actually Zoroastrian priests come and perform the ceremony, and people throw water on each other. So that is the story, that the arrow is shot, but to where? Biruni said, and not a tree. But in the Avesta, it's Mount Damavand. Now, different Persian and Muslim historians give different accounts of where this arrow lands. Tha'alabi, an important author in the early Islamic period, mentions Holm, which is in Afghanistan. And Holm has high mountains, as we were saying. But also, we should remember this Jauz that is mentioned. We have a locality in Afghanistan called Jozjan, which is also well known for its mountain. So really, the secondary mountain becomes far less important, but I think still it's the story of the mountain to the mountain, where the shot is launched. Now, Shapur I, which you saw his image, and I mentioned it to you, in his great inscription at Kabe Zartosht, gives us his long vitae in his Resgeste of his lineage, of course, what wars he had with the Romans, how he was successful, his invasion of Anatolia, and again, as such. Now, in this inscription, it's really interesting for me that there are 3 mountains mentioned in the context of this narrative. And so I've looked at this narrative where the mountains appear. In the beginning, of course, he mentions his northeastern, and this is along this Alborz ranges to the to the northwest. First, he says, "I am the lord of the empire of the Aryans, or the Iranians, and hold such and such areas." And he goes through province and province. The northwestern almost place is Armenia, Virujan, Sagan. This is in Anatolia, Bala Sagan, up to the Kaf, what is called Kafku in Middle Persian, which is in its Greek form, it's the Caucasus, to the gates of Valens. So it seems for him to demarcate the western boundary of the highest place in the northwest is one mountain, is the Caucasus mountain. Then when he moves to the east to describe his most eastern grasp of this empire of Erānšahr, of the Aryans, he again mentions a number of places, Hindustan, Kushan, up to Peshawar, which we've mentioned before, Kashsaq, and then mentions the Chachestan mountain. So again, the easternmost region, also there's a demarcation of a mountain. Very interesting. The 2 sites are the mountains that demarcate really as a natural boundary. But more importantly, there is a middle mountain. And this middle mountain, in Middle Persian, it is called Padishxwargar, and it's the mountain between Kaf, which would be somewhere around here in the Caucasus, and then Chachestan, which is really identified sometimes. This is the Alborz Range Mountains that goes on and it goes to the end of Khorasan. And Padishxwargar, texts say Ruyan or Tabaristan. So it's right in the middle here. So this mountain is the center, and these are the 2 boundaries. I think by mentioning these boundaries, he is consciously, somehow or unconsciously, making an allusion to the Arash story, where the 2 mountains were the natural boundary for the Iranians. And the highest peak of this mountain ranges is Mount Damavand, which I just pointed to, where among the Alborz mountain, this one is the most majestic. And in the Middle Persian exposition on the Avesta, in Middle Persian, it states that this mountain has the most amount of glory. Obviously, Ahura Mazda must have placed the most glory in the largest mountain peak coming from the earth. And so this mountain then begins to have a special history and tradition within the Iranian narrative. In effect, this Mount Damavand becomes a nationalized mountain where important events from the beginning of time and throughout history unfolds along with it. And that is why I think Zoroastrian priests, both the Iranian ones, perform jashan or ceremonies next to Mount Damavand as it becomes an important sacred site for the Iranians where the history unfolds. Here's Ramyar Karanjia, a priest, I think if you've been to India, he's a very well-known Zoroastrian priest who also has made the journey to the Mount Damavand and to perform a jashan. So again, the mountain becomes a central, an important place. And in fact, a chapter in a Middle Persian text of Bundahish has tried to transpose the Avesta names with the mountains that are on the Iranian plateau, and Damavand, of course, is the most important one, or the Harabarzaiti or Alborz, as is known as the mountain ranges. So in a sense, mountains become nationalized, and this one becomes the place, as some texts do mention, that it's where Arash actually launched his arrow to the east. So this becomes Arash's mountain in time with the nationalization of this mount, Damavand. I'd like to just simply finish by this nationalizing mountain with a recent poster that was made, I think, just after the recent election, where the new administration in Iran, which is a hardliner, has tried to actually, again, do another play on this mountain. Now, I do apologize that, again, I'm just showing this because I thought it's interesting. Arash is not this time shooting eastward, but is moving westward. And of course, it's not an arrow anymore, but it's the Iranians' missile program that is becoming important. And in an important poem, and unfortunately it has some Hebrew, and I didn't read it, but you could see of the rhetoric between Israel and Iran. Obviously, that is meant to be as such, where the national hero stands on a mountain and this time is shooting westward. And there's an important, famous poem in contemporary Iranian poetry, which was done by Delay Kasrai, an important communist author and poet, actually. And so you could see that various rhetorics, from the Avesta to the communist sort of poetry or leftist poetry, are being put together as propaganda in contemporary Iran and use Arash as such. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Touraj, for this presentation. Questions and comments?
Thank you so much, Touraj, for this wonderful talk. No, I want to ask you a specific aspect which we have already been discussing. You know that this Iranian national legend, national myth, is not present in the Shahnameh, as Antonio Panaino has shown, and he explained it. That kind, it was so much used by the Parthians that the Sasanians didn't like it. But on the other side, if you look what you have shown to us, it's a very much, let's say, northern Iranian, eastern Iranian topic which is included, and Fars is completely left outside.
Yes.
So could this also be? It is quite an interesting aspect, in my opinion. So that Fars is somehow left outside, and could this also explain, in your opinion, why the Sasanians, appear to have ignored it?
Yeah, I think in a way there is the old Achaemenid tradition of the great bowman and the Avestan tradition are being used into the personage of the king. The king, instead of Arash, is becoming the great bowman, as it is the tradition, and has used, I think, this tradition and excluded Arash in some ways. Arash does appear in the Shahnameh, but it appears during the reign of Khosrow II in the 7th century, when Bahram Chubin, the great Sasanian general who claims to be from the Arsakid family, they do this long sort of quarrel before the war. I think it's 590 and 591 CE, where Arash mentions that my great lineage is Arash. Yeah, And I think Khosrow responds that, yes, but they were subservient to the great king. And this goes on. So there we do have an allusion to it. And there's a mention of it. And this may well be, but this is really 7th century, of was the story snuffed out, or the king simply appropriated for whatever reason it is. That is much harder to tell.
So thank you for the presentation. And my question is, you said at the beginning was in the Yasht 19, there were 2,240 mountains grew from the earth in the beginning, and at the end the world will become flat. So the perfect situation for the earth is being flat.
Yes.
And they are performing rituals on the mountains. So it did not become clear to me, is the mountain now something good or bad?
Sure.
Or
I think the idea of Earth as being flat is something that Bruce Lincoln has written as part of the Indo-European tradition, where at the end of time the mountains, actually the Earth becomes flat as it was in the beginning and perfect. So it's not only, I think, the Zoroastrian tradition that has that. That is part of its, I think, heritage. Now, to explain the mountains, of course, now you have this Zoroastrianization of this, where yes, mountains were the attack of Ahriman, right? However, by Ahura Mazda sort of inserting the glory into the mountains, they become not only important, but they become actually as a stabilizing force for the earth. Yeah. In fact, earthquakes and so on are protected by the mountains. So it now turns into a positive force, because there's this constant struggle. I can give you many other examples of things that may sound, good and bad. They may have two different things. Flowers, they're wonderful, but some have thorns as a result of, Ahriman's struggle. So that can take place in mountains or other things.
Thank you for enlightening presentation. I would like to ask a question which I guess betrays my ignorance, but how popular is the idea of marking a border with shooting an arrow? Here, of course, he shot exceptionally well, more than 1,000 kilometers, I guess, from Tehran basically to Khorasan. I'm asking because, as far as I remember, this great temple of Artemis in Ephesus, which was Asilos, and had this area around it marked as Asilos too. So this was a privilege, okay? And this grew in various stages. At one point, the area, the distance of the border of this Asilia was marked by arrow shot from the top of the temple. So I don't know how popular this idea was or how specific it was, and whether in situation like that we can think of lasting Iranian influence, which we know, for instance, the 4th century BCE was very strong in Ephesus.
So, in terms of boundary markers, I should say actually to the contrary. We know very little about boundary markers in the Sasanian or sort of in the Iranian world. In fact, I can think of Moses Khorenatsi, for example, the great Armenian historian, mentions that Ardashir, the founder of the Sasanian Empire, rearranged things and actually created boundaries or ordered boundaries on the for the northern boundaries. But that is neither here nor there. And also in the Iranian tradition, what I think of first are Middle Persian texts, such as a geographical text that mentions, again, one of these superheroes, Sfandiat, by his lance is actually made the marker between itself and I think the Turkic tribes or the Hunnic tribes that look at the lance. If you see the vibration of this lance, as in this arrow, its vibration is it appears to be important. That means you have now gone beyond your reach, and you must retreat. And again, this reminds me of Darius's inscription again. The Persian spear has gone far and wide. So spear seems to be that object. Now, what the relation between a spear and an arrow is, again, something to think about, but I do not know of any other examples in the Iranian tradition.
So thank you very much, Touraj, for your fantastic presentation. Just a small remark. Alexander, when he was campaigning against their, when he was on his quest for pesos, he pushed through these mountains, through the Damavand mountains, and yeah, that's really interesting because there were people living on this mountain, and he put much effort into defeating them, and this was when he used Iranian
Mountaineer
archers. So perhaps this could be also some background to this Alexander
remind
story.
me of Alexander coming to Asia and sort of throwing his spear, right? To own, but something else. Yeah.
Sorry, but you looked at me, so I...
Yes, Alexander, yes.
But that's I think, a bit different because he was not marking border, but was throwing the spear into sand and then jumping out of the boat as the first one. So that's a clear reference to Homer, because we have a Homeric hero who also jumped into the land. And of course, it reminds us of this Hellenistic concept of dorictetos horao, land won with a spear. So that's, I think, is that's not marking the border, although the spear is in action, okay? But it's taking
ownership.
Ownership of all of Asia. That is of the Persian Empire.
It's a symbol of taking, as opposed to back.
Further questions or comments for all? Then I would like to thank you very much,
Thank you
Touraj,
very much.
for your paper.
Thank you.